Okay, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Welcome to an amazing Saturday session. Truly amazing because we are now starting on the journey with Surah Al-Maida, which is such a heavy night. I mean, you feel, or I feel sort of the weight of it because, as we've said here, this is the last major surah that we have not yet, or that Sheikh has not yet talked about in either the line-by-line form or in Project Illumine. So after we finish this surah, then he will have completed the entire Quran, and that is just mind-blowing. And this journey started, over 20 years ago. And each halakha engagement has been hours long, and we've really done deep dives into every single chapter. And so when you think back to everything that we have learned or received, and it's all out there on the internet for people to work their way through, it's truly stunning and truly a gift. And I just wanted to point out, oftentimes I remember back to when I was an early convert and just not really aware at all about Islamic scholarship or Islamic scholars. I just assumed, anytime I would hear the word, scholar, someone's a scholar, I just automatically assumed that there was this body of knowledge that everyone else knew that I didn't, and that it was all kind of more or less the same. Like everybody, I was late to the party, I was the last one to join, and everyone knew everything but me. And as I continued on this journey, you actually start learning that it is so, it's like anything else. Everything is unique to a person, and it is not that the tafsirs are all the same, or there's this common body of knowledge among scholars, or that there's any monolith of understanding of the Quran. And especially this journey that we've taken with Project Illumine has been just so unique and special. And anyone who spent any time hearing about the Quran anywhere else, once you come here and you hear what is presented in Project Illumine, you just feel like you can't go back. It's just in its own class. And I continue to get so much mail and emails and communications from people who have just said that this Project Illumine engagement has really transformed their life. And so if people are just joining on now, it's really amazing what a gift we've all been given. And if you want to join us on this journey, just to give you an update, we started this program called Adopt a Surah, and it was a way to sponsor the publication of this entire tafsir, which we have been working on as we have been working through the surahs here in the halakas. And we only have 8 surahs left out of the 114 yet to be adopted. So if you want to join us on this journey, definitely go to our website, and you can find under the Project Illumine tab, there's an Adopt a Surah section. But I want to thank everyone, because that actually is a really huge deal to have that kind of support. And there's anyone who joins us on this journey and supports the work here, the hasanat is shared with you, because we couldn't have done it without everyone's support. So thank you so much. And I wanted to just again call attention, as always, to a really important khutbah yesterday, which is entitled "Don't Be Stupid About Your Package and What About Gaza?" And so what that means about not being stupid about your package is Sheikh talks about how all of us will end up on the final day bringing our package of what we've done in our lives, and and meeting God, inshallah. And there's it's a really critical point that what is in our package, what will we be held accountable for, has so much to do with our understanding of what have we done in this life in terms of justice and injustice, what we bring, what we could have done. And one of the really, really critical points that Sheikh talked about yesterday was this idea that we are all, everything that we have in our lives is gifted, but each person has a unique gift. If you've been given a talent, for example, in music, or a talent for philosophy, or a talent for art, everyone has that particular gift that you have personally been given. And part of what you will be held accountable for is whether you took that gift and you developed it and you did something with it, and hopefully in the service of God. But it's a little bit mind-blowing. It's like if you were given the gift of, let's say, art, and you never developed it, that, it's a horrible idea that you will be held accountable for that on the final day. And I think about our community and the push for people that, are really directed towards pursuing medicine and engineering. And, even though that's not necessarily what they love or wanted, but because that was something that they thought they had to do. And so this is a really important point. But also, as Sheikh was explaining, to me afterwards, is this idea that even you have to create as a society the means for people to pursue their gifts freely. And that's something that is, obviously incumbent upon all of us. But so the khutbah yesterday was just really important in terms of understanding like what we owe, what we owe God in terms of what God has given us, in terms of our relationships with ourselves, with other human beings, and with God directly. So it's a really powerful, important khutbah that everyone should listen to. And then the end, the second khutbah, what I found really troubling was the whole concept of what's happening in Israel with this very right-wing government and what we can potentially anticipate will happen in Gaza once that leadership takes over. And there was a really powerful article that Chris Hedges wrote called Israel and the Rise of Jewish Fascism, that kind of laid it all out about what is happening and, made the point that this is not conjecture, but this is actually, what has happened in the past. Some of these characters that are now about to assume positions of power in the Israeli government. For example, one of them was turned away from the Israeli army because he was too extreme. But now he is going to be in charge of what happens to the people in Palestine in terms of their security. And, he's been very vocal. I think his last name is Ben Gavir or something like that. I'm sorry, Ben Gavir. He has definitely expressed repeatedly how, his support for genocide, effectively. So this is really obviously disturbing. You're not talking about something that's really far away. We're talking about something that could literally be in the horizon of the next 6 months, us seeing a dramatic change in what's happening. And it weighs on me, what do we as Muslims here in America, where we have freedom to, do things about it, what are we going to do about that? So anyway, again, I would really encourage you to watch the khutbah, to, look up this article. It's actually, the link to the article is in the description for the khutbah. So you can find Chris Hedges, the piece on Jewish fascism. It's a really important read. So anyway, there's just so much going on in the world, and every time we have an opportunity to come here and reconnect with our Quran and reconnect with the message here, and now that we've done, reached this monumental milestone of actually touching every single surah, and we still have more to do. Thankfully, we have a lot of these short surahs left to do in the Project Illumine approach, which, as you have seen in the ones that we've done, are just dynamite. They're out of this world. We still, have a lot of engagement, but this is where the learning and the grounding and the comfort, I think, can come, through this education, and also the encouragement to try and think about what we can do to fight for justice in our world. So I'm so grateful for this entire gift, and so I'm so looking forward to the start of Surah Al-Maida. May Allah bless this session, bless all of our sessions, and allow us to hear and learn and internalize what we need to learn. So thank you, Sheikh. Thank you for joining us.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. وسبحان الله العلي العظيم والحمد لله رب العالمين اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على الحبيب المصطفى محمد خاتم الرسل والأنبياء أجمعين المرسل رحمة للعالمين وعلى آله الأطهار الميامين وعلى أصحابه المختارين وعلى من اتبعه بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. اللهم اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي يا رب العالمين. Grace is right. Surah At-Tawbah weighs upon me. Last night I prayed istikhara on what should I do next, and I thought that the answer that came was quite clear, that I should proceed on to Surah At-Tawbah. Surah Al-Maida, Surah Al-Maida, and which is just, this journey, which now effectively has covered the entire Quran, but Surah Al-Maida and the few short surah that were covered in classical style, but not in Project Illum style. Um, you can't reach this point without thinking about your own personal responsibility. Um, Nothing is as terrifying and as weighty and heavy and stressful as the responsibility of the scholar. Every time you teach, every time you communicate something, you immediately put yourself on trial. Effectively, you put yourself on trial before Allah for the implicit charge of hypocrisy. I've taught what I've taught, but do I rise to what I've taught? Am I personally, as a human being, as a teacher of this material, am I at par with what I've taught? And for all of you, anyone that hears this, if you teach, then you've also accepted the responsibility before Allah that your own conduct, your own seerah, your own path in life has to rise to the level of what you've taught. And that is terrifying. And I think you will see even more once we're done with Surah Al-Ma'idah, why it is so weighty and why it is so heavy. Because of my anxiety about my responsibility before Allah, that very simple but straightforward but critical issue of Allah saying, well, by teaching a doctrine, there is always an implication. There's always the implication that you rise to what this doctrine demands, that you are as good as what you've taught. And because of the fear of that, I resisted for over 20 years sharing my journey with the Quran with anyone. Until, of course, came the other part, katmul ilm, which when you suppress knowledge, if Allah has given you knowledge. And as we will see in Surah Al-Ma'idah, any knowledge that Allah gives a human being, it is knowledge from Allah. We are but vehicles for what Allah teaches. And how do you weigh between these two? And it's a very but I am persuaded, personally, I have a very strong conviction that the approach to the Quran that I've represented and that we've gone through has the potential to transform this ummah. And that it harkens back to that moment when the words of this revelation transformed human beings entirely, literally transformed them from the age of Jahiliyyah to an age of civilization and morals and ethics and values. Did the impossible. Of course, we are living in a time when, I am presenting this material. We are planting these seeds in soil that is struggling to survive. There are so many forces in our world that constantly attack viable Muslim soil and seek to impoverish it so that it births nothing and it nourishes nothing and it grows nothing. Just the fact, when I started this journey, I thought that it is extremely difficult for me to be able to present this material while teaching, while basically having a full-time job. And as usual, you make an appeal to the wealthy people of this ummah, and you say, help in something as basic as teaching God's words and God's message. And sadly, I wanted to be surprised, pleasantly surprised, but I wasn't. And it is not the wealthy people that supported this project. It is the common people. The people who adopted the surah so far are the people who are not the richest of the ummah. Our plight is in the ineffectiveness and uselessness of our richest members. And what it is often, whether an ummah rises or falls, is in direct proportion to those who monopolize and hold wealth and what they do with this wealth. I'm saying all of this because now we're very close. I can see the end, where at least these halaqas will come to a conclusion, and the lessons communicated will be out there, and starts a new phase, a phase that I don't know if I will live to see completed. That's in Allah's hands, of trying to publish this material. But I have to tell you, it has the taste and the ring of truth. It has the taste and the ring of nur, of the light of our faith, the truth to our faith. And I pray that Allah accepts it from me, and I pray that Allah protects it, and I pray that Allah furthers it. And I pray that everyone that had an opportunity to learn from this tafsir doesn't do what Muslims have become so good at, and that is apathy. That they don't surrender to apathy and just take what they want and basically do nothing to protect or to nourish, to protect the Muslim soil, to protect the Muslim seed, to allow something to grow for our future generations. Think of how many generations now of Muslims since colonialism and since, of course, the crumbling of the Islamic Khilafah, but even before that, since colonialism. Think of how many Muslim generations, their relationship to the Quran has been effectively severed. And as a result, how many Muslim generations have come and gone in a state of moral and ethical loss. Their only real relationship with Islam is an apologetic one, is a defensive one. What they do towards their faith is basically try to defend it against perceived attacks and real attacks by others. But there's no growth. There's no husn. There's no actual goodness. There is no actual Quranic impact. There's barely the survival of the Quranic discourse in a defensive mode, but nothing beyond that. And it is Muslim apathy, and it is Muslim jahl, ignorance, and it is the wasted resources of Islam. We live in an age where Muslims will invest millions of dollars in a soccer player or a soccer team, while there isn't a single Muslim institution that comes even close to the 24 hours, 7 days a week Arab evangelist station that broadcasts from Cyprus, or the type of support someone like, compare the type of support that someone like Rashid Hamami has received to the type of support that someone like me has received in life. Those of you who don't know, Rashid Hamami is a purported convert to Christianity. A Moroccan who, what is his background is full of obscurity and vagueness, but that's what he says, is that he's a Muslim Moroccan that converted to Christianity. Rashid Hamami has made a career, an entire career. He has no other job. He doesn't have to worry about making a living. He doesn't have to worry about teaching. He doesn't have to worry about any other task other than every day he goes to work. All he does is attack Islam. He is on the air 6 days a week, every week, supported by millions of dollars, and I know that he is not just supported by money from a wealthy Texan, a woman from Texas, but he's also supported by money from wealthy Christian Arabs, including Coptic Egyptians, including medical doctors here in the United States who are Coptic Egyptians, who donate to Rashid Hamami checks of 150,000, 250,000, so that he can every day of every week broadcast as 6 to 8 hours a day, doing nothing but attacking the Quran. He's the guy that posted a $30,000 reward for people who can compose a text better than the Quran. This was a competition he held, and he ended up awarding the 30,000 to someone. I've mentioned that competition before. But this is just one. And people are, if you realized how many Rashid Hamamis there are, that if you realize the amount of money that wealthy people spend to attack this faith, to put your children and my children, to put our grandchildren in a position of confusion and weakness and defensiveness and shame about being Muslim, because that is the net effect of all of this, is that your children and my children will go and will eventually get exposed to this material, either directly or indirectly, and the sense of shame, whether expressed explicitly or not, about being Muslim, and the sense of defensiveness about being Muslim prevents the growth of any viable seed. So we have, since colonialism, we have been exerting all our energies in a defensive posture to the extent that nothing grows. There is no added value to anything in terms of Muslim intellectual production. And you stand there and you say, Allah, be considering Allah's message and what we've learned about the Quran so far, and what inshallah we'll learn about Surah Al-Maida. It is as if the opponents of Islam are the ones heeding Allah's message in spending in the path of fighting Islam. Allah exhorted Muslims to spend in the path of Islam. But I am not kidding you people, we don't have a single, not one institution of the caliber or the funding or the reach of the television stations, the print institutions, meaning publications, the think tanks, Usuli Institute exists on a bare budget, but real institutes that are actually really funded by millions of dollars that do nothing but attack your faith. It is, I mean, I don't know what we're going to. When the United States opens up an entire television station in the Arab world called Al-Hurra, a TV station called Al-Hurra, and that means it's funded by tax dollars, your tax dollars and my tax dollars. But Al-Hurra, yes, it represents the American view on current affairs, but it also does something else that is very nefarious. It provides a platform for Islamophobes, for Muslim Islamophobes, like Ibrahim Isa. Ibrahim Isa, who again does nothing but cast doubt on the Quran, cast doubt on the Sunnah, cast doubt on the character of the Prophet, cast doubt on the character of the companions, is employed by Al-Hurra channel, given a very handsome salary from our tax dollars to do nothing in his regular presentation And he writes, by the way, scripts for movies that do the same thing. He writes articles for newspapers. And again, this is just another one example. Or there's another guy, Islam al-Bahiri, who's also supported by our tax dollars through Hurra channel. Islam al-Bahiri is a declared atheist who does nothing. He receives his salary from Al-Hurra channel, our tax dollars, to trash Islam. So it doesn't take a genius. Money assigned by Congress to fund a TV station in the Muslim world is in turn using this money to fund people who have an ideological project. They never say one critical word about Christianity. They never say a single critical word about Judaism. Not even Jewish militants who are in power with Netanyahu. Their entire discourse is about all the things that are wrong with Islam. And what, on the other side of the coin, we couldn't even get a single wealthy Muslim, with all the Muslim millionaires that exist in the world today, to fund a scholar of the Quran so they can focus on teaching the Quran for a year or two. Not a single Muslim among all these millionaires. Not a single one of them. I mean, they go and they fund something, I don't want to name institutions, but entirely useless institutions. It is, the disparity between doctrine and reality is what forces the best of our scholars into silence. It's like, what do you say to a paradoxical reality that truly challenges your comprehension? Or it challenges even your sanity. So Surah Al-Maida you'll find, as we will see, there's a lot of, in the tradition, a lot of contradictory, conflicting things, and we'll explain the reasons for these contradictory reports, that it is clear that Surah Al-Ma'idah is a revelation around the time of Hajjat al-Wada. And in fact, all the evidence is that after Surah Al-Ma'idah is revealed, the Prophet ﷺ lived only 80 or 81 days. That he died 80 or 81 days, so a few weeks after Surah Al-Ma'idah. And as you will see, Surah Al-Ma'idah is in fact a revelation that clearly has in mind the conclusion of the Prophet's journey. So it is not revealed, and this will become important later as we go through Surah Al-Ma'idah. It is not revealed at the time of Fath Makkah. Fath Makkah is in the 8th Hijrah, right? 8th year. It is not revealed at the time of Fath Makkah. It is revealed later than that. It's revealed the 10th Hijrah. Only 80 days before the death of the Prophet, and around the time of Hajjatul Wada, or the final pilgrimage. This is when the after the conquering of Mecca, the Prophet ﷺ returns to Medina, but visits Mecca again for the final pilgrimage. And it is in this final year where Surah Al-Maida is revealed. And it is very clear that Allah is telling Muslims, okay, the journey is over, and I am communicating to you the last prescriptions. And there is something about Surah Al-Ma'idah that is never pointed out, that it complements and is a natural conclusion of Surah Al-Baqarah. So it comes full circle. You have the principles of the message, the foundation of the message laid out in the Mecca period. And if you remember Surah Al-Baqarah, the first revelation in Medina, it applies the principles of the Mecca period in a, first and foremost, in challenging the idea that Allah picks favorites, or that Allah has a chosen people, and it lays the foundation for a covenantal relationship, that the way that Allah relates is that Allah teaches human beings certain principles and values, and that your relationship to your Maker is in direct proportion to how you relate to these values and principles, the extent to which you embody these values and these principles, and that this is the covenantal relationship, and that the covenantal relationship is not a status. And subhanAllah, I mean, in the, as I've emphasized repeatedly, the notion that people are born in a status, that the notion that people are sort of that, you know, that everything is fated, that in the stars, in the cosmos, in the planets, and that part of human beings' fate is who is a lower caste and who is a higher caste, who's born to be a king and who's born to be a prince or a princess, and who's born to be the drudge of society, who's born to be a slave, who's born to be free, a free person. And this is entirely challenged by Islam. And as we saw in Surah Al-Baqarah, what animated Islam, when Islam is the meaning of monotheism, and that the meaning of monotheism is that you submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but that submission to Allah frees you as opposed to everything else. And that there is no birthright status. That the whole idea that there are people born to be poor, or people born to be rich, people born to be slaves, people born to be free men or women, that this is entirely challenged by, and it takes Muslims, or it takes human beings back to a reminder of what a covenantal relationship means. Mind you, that when Allah talks about the Israelites having corrupted the doctrines of a covenantal relationship, they corrupted it by the doctrine of a chosen people, that we are God's people regardless of what we've done with the covenant. And that Christians have also corrupted it by the whole idea that there is an original sin, and as long as you accept Jesus Christ, then you're God's people, God's chosen people, regardless of what you've done with the covenant. And the part, and remember, this is pre-Protestantism, pre-Reformation, so the Catholic Church was anchored in the idea that as long as you are good with the Catholic Church, that is the full representation of the covenant with God. You need not worry about anything else. And from the time that Surah Al-Baqarah comes, giving effect to the Quran of Mecca, Surah Al-Baqarah comes and challenges all of that and says that's nonsense. The relationship between a human being and their God is direct and personal. There's no entitlement. You can't take God for granted. You can't take God, the covenant, for granted. You can't take your status for granted. And this is the Islamic revolution. And then we took our journey with all the demonstrative examples that we saw during the Medina period, all the ups and downs and all the lessons that Allah imparts to Muslims, until we now come to Surah Al-Maida and how Allah is going to close this message so that this becomes the inheritance of Muslims for ages to come, until the hereafter, until the final day. What Muslims are going to carry. And look at how Surah Al-Ma'idah begins. This beginning deserves pause and reflection. Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu, ufu bil-uqud. The very beginning of Surah Al-Ma'idah. This is after Mecca has been defeated. This is after the Battle of Khaybar. This is now where the Muslims are going on a pilgrimage, and they hear the Prophet tell them, I don't know if I'm going to be with you next year. Although those who are faithful are in denial, but they can tell that the Prophet ﷺ is getting old, and that the idea, the thought of the Prophet ﷺ parting with them is something that is worrying them. And the first words of Surah Al-Ma'idah, Ufu bil-uqud. Now, so the first words is, and Muhammad Asad translates it as, be true to your covenants. Now, Muhammad Asad is probably right in translating it as be true to your covenants instead of honor your contracts. I'm not sure why he chose, because he doesn't explain why he chose the word covenant instead of contract for uqud. But Allahu Alam, but I think that having studied Surah Al-Ma'idah in its totality, he realizes that the uqud mentioned here at the beginning of Surah Al-Ma'idah is not talking about just marital contracts or commercial contracts, but it is talking about every promissory situation that human beings find themselves in. It is as if the first words of Surah Al-Ma'idah is, you want to understand, or you want to know the principle upon which all morality, all virtue is built. It is this simple principle. You exist within a relationship of obligations, whether explicit or implicit. What is the proof of this? Is that even so many commentators, when commenting about the beginning of Surah Al-Ma'idah, they said, well, the opening of Surah Al-Ma'idah makes us think about all the uqud that, in fact, in all the promissory or all the obligations or relationships of obligation that bond or tie a human being from the time a human being comes to existence. And this is what I've mentioned in the khutbah, that there are contracts, or if you will, obligations, covenants that are owed to God. There are contracts, obligations owed to other human beings, and there are obligations or covenants owed to the self. And that there is no right without a corollary duty. So your relationship with Allah, everything that you receive, if you are qalil al-adab, if you have no manners, you are a person of ill manners, you would say, what Allah gave me are gifts of entitlement, and I owe nothing in return. And you would say, well, I didn't ask for these, so whatever I receive from Allah is a windfall. It's like, well, you've sent it to me, you've gave it to me, I'll enjoy it, but I owe you nothing. But our ancestors actually discussed this at length and said, but this is the posture only of people without akhlaq, without manners, without virtue. It is not virtuous for you to keep receiving and to say, I owe nothing in return. That is not what a person of karama does, a person of honor and dignity does. Your continued use of what Allah has given you as a matter of virtue creates corollary obligations. But you are also entrusted with yourself. You are entrusted with your body. You are entrusted with your intellect. You are entrusted with your feelings. And you cannot make use of the self without corollary obligations. But this is even ever more so true when it comes to your positions in society. And subhanallah, I mean, if those of you, if you ever get the chance to read Hayy bin Yaqzan, the famous text, the basis from which Robinson's Crusoe was plagiarized, you know that story about a person on an island, and what type of rights and duties and so on, and what type of innate knowledge. This is an Islamic story, but the narrative of Al-Hayy bin Yaqzan is anchored in the Quranic ethics of which again have influenced the European Reformation and the idea of an implied contract, an implied social contract, the core of Lockean philosophy, or the philosophy of Rousseau. Or, I mean, it is not an exaggeration to say that you can hardly find any part of Western philosophy that doesn't harken back to the idea of an implied social contract in one form or another. I mean, there are more liberal orientations and more conservative orientations, but the entire edifice of Western philosophy is premised on this, and what Western philosophers often credit this idea of a covenantal relationship, that all social interactions rely on an implied covenant, or all political theory, it relies on an implied contract, to Christianity. But the only way it works is by saying, well, it comes from Christianity after the Reformation. The reality, though, is that it's actually not anchored in Christian thought or Jewish thought. It is anchored in Islamic thought. The core of morality is a covenantal relationship, an implied moral contract that quite simply says you cannot ask about what your rights are without a proper investigation and admissions of what your duties are. And this is as to social relationships, as to your relationship with God, and as to your relationship with self. This is a little bit, in fact, in Western thinking, or in non-Islamic thinking, you notice that social contract theory, which, as I said, is at the core of so much Western philosophy, because it suffers from certain core inconsistencies that are never quite resolved. Although in theory it says that there is a correlation between rights and duties, a proper critique of Western philosophies, you will find that doctrinally, the balance between rights and duties is often skewed. That in fact, and I think this comes indeed from Christian salvational philosophy, that you start out by saying, for every right there is a duty, and every duty there is a right. But once you actually start working through your philosophy, you end up affirming a whole host of rights without parallel duties. And because the theology of your philosophy has accepted the idea that rights could be a matter of status, not a matter of relationship. I know that this is a little bit advanced philosophy, but for whatever it's worth, for those who understand what I'm talking about, I've got to put it out there. That, remember, the Islamic message comes and says it is not a matter of status, it is a matter of relationships. At the time, the prevailing moral philosophies in the world, Catholicism and Judaism, affirmed morality as a matter of status. The Western philosophy, I believe, has adopted a myth that they have liberated themselves from status morality to relational morality. But I think, just read a lot of the current Western philosophers, the most prominent philosophers of the West. You will find that the entire argument about rights, correlation, and a relationship between rights and duties falls apart in application as they work through their philosophical problems, where they end up affirming status morality rather than relational morality. Now, why is this so important? Well, to put it quite simply, if you hold a right and your right is not related to your obligations, you could very easily end up affirming egocentric positions. Positions where a person says, I have a right to enjoy what I enjoy, and, let the rest of the world go to hell. Or situations where, let's say you own a plot of land, and this plot of land, let's just pretend hypothetically, is, is part of, you own the Amazon rainforest. And if you destroy, you own it, it's your private property. But if you destroy it, you're going to kill off humanity because you're going to affect the production of oxygen in the world. If your social thinking as to rights and duties is not balanced, you end up having a very difficult time defending the idea of why don't I have the right to do with my private property as I wish, regardless of the social consequences upon others. This is precisely the Quranic morality, Quranic philosophy comes and says, this paradigm is insane, it's incomprehensible. Because the idea that you can just simply own a right, regardless of how that right impacts upon others, is non-Quranic. Are you guys be able to follow what I'm saying? I'm trying to not use technical terms and to just, bring it down to earth so it's clear. But it's a very critical point. So Allah comes to this very last message. And you can imagine, these Muslims, the Muslims who've now have gone through this journey of, the hijrah, the battles and everything, and they're waiting to hear at this very late stage what Allah is going to be telling them. And Allah starts with honor your obligations. In a word, ufu bil uqud. It's like saying honor your obligations. And if you're not with the program, you pause and say, what? Instead of telling me, protect Islam, fight, fight for the whatever to preserve your gains. But this is what you're telling me? And yes, because it is the core of everything. Now, think in retrospect. When you find a Muslim with a poor work ethic, what is the core of this poor work ethic? It is the failure to honor obligations. A Muslim who there are why is it that we innately describe someone with a good work ethic as an Islamic ethic? Even if you're one of the lazy Muslims or Muslims who doesn't actually follow the teachings of Islam, but you innately recognize that a person with a good work ethic is acting Islamically. The core of that is al-wafa' bil-uqud. That the idea that you are receiving payment and not performing the work innately strikes you as haram. But even if you're not receiving payment, the very fact that you gave your word, remember, what is it that we learn about? Well, I mean, if you study old Arab culture, not current Arab culture, current Arab culture is in the doldrums. I mean, it's just completely trash. But old Arab culture, what strikes you about medieval Arab culture, expressed in their poetry, is that if I give you a word, I will even sacrifice my life to honor my word. The old Arab culture, people, if they gave you their word, not only can you count on it, but people will sacrifice their entire lives to uphold a word that they gave. That's completely gone now, right? That's completely gone. But that's exactly the attitude that is needed to build a civilization. A people who honor their word. If they say, I will do, they will do. You can depend on me, you can depend on them. If they say yes, it's a yes. If they say no, it's a no. And so when Allah begins with this, ufu bil uqud, what is striking to me is that even in the reports we have from Ibn Abbas, for instance, about this beginning of Surah Al-Maida, is that Ibn Abbas doesn't take it as Allah saying, honor your commercial contracts or honor your marital contracts. Ibn Abbas' reaction, so, among the earliest commentators of the Quran, reaction to this, the beginning of Surah Al-Maida, is that honor your words. Live up. Don't be people who say, I will do, but then you can't count on them. So, and then I'll show you why Surah Al-Ma'idah, later on, the critical importance of Surah Al-Ma'idah beginning with this. Now, so, right after Allah tells us this, Surah Al-Ma'idah, not even in a new ayah, but in the right, the next normative command, starts talking about what are, or put it this way, clarifying normative questions that have come up but focused on, and just remember this word for now, focused on the sha'air al-Islam, the, well, I'll use the word rituals for now, but we'll get more clarity about it a bit later. So that, and the first sort of issue that Allah starts clarifying, أحلت لكم بهيمة الأنعام إلا ما يتلى عليكم غير محلي الصيد وأنتم حرم إن الله يحكم ما يريد يا أيها الذين آمنوا لا تحلوا شعائر الله ولا الشهر الحرام ولا الهدي ولا القلائد ولا آمين البيت الحرام يبتغون فضلا من ربهم ورضوانا وإذا حللتم فاصطادوا ولا يجرمنكم شنآن قوم على قوم أن صدوكم عن المسجد الحرام أن تعتدوا وتعاونوا على البر والتقوى ولا تعاونوا على الإثم والعدوان واتقوا الله إن الله شديد العقاب. Okay, so right after أوفوا بالعقود, honor your obligations, lawful to you is the flesh of beasts that feed on plants, بهيمة الأنعام, save what is mentioned to you okay, so flesh of beasts that eat plants. However, you are not allowed to hunt while you are in a state of pilgrimage. The actual issue that comes up during Hajjatul Wada is a sort of a practical issue of, well, when we are in a state of ihram, as we are in this state of pilgrimage, are we allowed to consume meat? And the answer comes very clearly, well, you're not allowed to hunt, but you can eat halal meat, basically, the meat other than the you can eat meat that you purchase, but you can't hunt the food. Okay, so but this is the sort of immediate specific response is given to underscore a bigger point, and I'll explain what's going on in a second. Okay, so believers, لا تحلوا شعائر الله. Allah is warning you that Islam has a sha'air. The singular of sha'air is sha'ira. And the sha'air, which we often, translate conveniently as ritual, Isha'ira, plural sha'air, are ma'lam or ma'alim, meaning they are what becomes the signs of your faith. So, not every law is isha'ira min sha'air ad-din. Not every law is a signpost of your faith. But Allah is putting you on notice that being Muslim is anchored on a set of values, but it's also anchored on understanding basic rituals. We don't always understand the reason for these rituals, but there are signposts of the faith that you must honor. So, for instance, why is it that meat that is hunted, that is meat that we obtain using a hunting dog or a falcon, is halal for us to consume, but meat obtained by striking an animal on its head, for instance, beating an animal to death, is not halal? There are ritualistic aspects to your faith that become like signposts. These are known as sha'ir. And Allah warns you that don't violate, don't dilute what becomes these signposts of your faith. Now, we'll see that this is important because Allah warns us that this is precisely what earlier recipients, Jews and Christians, did with their religion. And Allah is warning Muslims not to follow in these footsteps. Now, think of how easy it is to violate this. When you see, for instance, when years ago, when I started this tafsir project, I remember that someone asked me about the book written by the late Shahab Ahmad, What is Islam? And it is fair to say that one big impact of that book is to try to argue that it is Islamic or Islamically defensible to consume alcohol. And if you go back to my response to this book, one of the things that I found very disturbing is how many young intellectualized Muslims, especially Muslims in academia, were impressed by the reductive argument of this book, that effectively what it does, it's the net effect of the book is to say Islam is not built on any specific sha'ir. This is the natural inclination of human beings, is that because sha'ir, the rituals, are often built on things that are not accessible to human reason. Why do we pray Dhuhr 4 rakat? Why do we pray Al-Maghrib 3 rakat? You know, it is always easy to try to go in and deconstruct these elements. But what Allah is warning you at the very end of the Islamic revelation is don't fall prey to these attempts that come and say, why can't we drink alcohol as Muslims? That's what Shahab Ahmad's, his book starts out with him drinking alcohol, and a professor asks him, how could you be a Muslim and you're drinking? And he says, no, I'm from a Muslim family that has always been drinking, and we've been drinking for generations. And in fact, the entire book, I'm going to prove to you that you can be entirely a good Muslim and drink alcohol. There's no problem with that. And then I found all these Muslim kids, including, I've heard, I think it was, who don't obliviously don't see the danger of jumping on the bandwagon of someone who's saying, well, why should we care if Islam has sha'air or not? Why Allah in Surah Al-Maida exactly, but Allah here it's telling you, don't follow in the footsteps of those before you who received Allah's covenant and lost Allah's covenant precisely because of what they ended up doing with sha'air. Again, if you are one of the, because I don't know if it's still, academia has these fads. And, when I was in graduate school, it was Harkoon's book, Rethinking Islam, that was the fad. And, all the intellectualized young Muslims, every Muslim who wanted to be cool, thinking intellectual Muslims, was going around blabbing about Harkoon's book. It's so cool, Harkoon's book, Rethinking Islam. Then, of course, when I started this project, it was Ahmad Shahab's book, What is Islam? And then I would hear all these young Muslims who started drinking because of Shahab Ahmad's book, and they started drinking alcohol and saying, why should the texts be privileged with meaning? Why should the experts of law be the ones who call the normative obligation? But effectively what they've done is they've deconstructed all normative obligations in Islam, including all the sha'air of Islam. So if you want to see an example of why precisely Allah warns us about لا تحل شعائر الله, that sha'ira, it's a signpost. It is what Allah delegates to you as in a covenantal relationship of you are obligated to take care of it and honor it, even if you don't understand it. Okay, now, what follows that is, and this is, so honor the sha'air, and as we talked about sha'air. وَالشَّهْرَ al-haram. There is a discussion here about what that expression, وَالشَّهْرَ al-haram, the sacred month, is what is intended, the sacred months of pilgrimage, or what is intended, the sacred month, which, as we know, is Rajab, Muharram, Dhul Qa'dah, and Ramadan, or Dhul Hijjah. Muhammad Asad, in his translation, puts in brackets the sacred months of pilgrimage. I don't agree with that. I think he's wrong. I think what Allah is saying is that Allah knows that the challenge will be to actually honor the sacred month, which we've talked about earlier, that it will be really a challenge to treat Rajab and Dhul Qa'dah and Dhul Hijjah and Muharram as a sacred months and to give them their due, to postpone conflicts, to postpone even, to go out of your way to prevent, to avoid any bloodshed. This is, critical, and we've talked about this, critical for the concept of sacred time. There are 4 months in the year that Allah is putting you on notice. These months, you are to avoid conflicts, avoid rancor, avoid bloodshed, and as we in fact saw, it didn't even take that long for Muslims to completely violate that covenant. To the point that most Muslims today don't even, these 4 months, if they are even aware of the coming of Dhul Hijjah or Dhul Qa'dah, they don't mark them in their psyche. Tell me how many Muslims in the world will say, you know what, I have a temper problem, but I cannot allow my temper to flare in the 4 sacred months because that would be truly haram. Or, I argue with my family all the time, but I cannot be argumentative in the 4 sacred month because that's truly haram. Or I have a depression problem, but it would be haram for me to indulge in my melancholy in the 4 sacred months because Allah's eyesight is particularly on me during the 4 sacred months. That ethic is completely obliterated. You see how easily we obliterate sha'air Allah? This is sha'ir, I mean a sha'ir. So when Allah comes and says, now this is at the very end, I am entrusting you that you will honor the 4th sacred month. Then, وَلَا الْهَدْيِ وَلَا الْقَلَائِدِ. Now here, that Muhammad Asad translates this, nor against the garlands offerings, nor against those who... So, okay. وَلَا الْهَدْيِ وَلَا الْقَلَائِدِ. The pre-Islamic Arabs would mark the animals that were going to be sacrificed as offerings with a particular garland. I mean, that's the word for it. It's a qilada, something that is put around the neck. And some Muslims, just because this was a practice by pre-Islamic Arabs, started saying that it is un-Islamic to put these garlands around the necks of animals, or these that, literally like what we call later on becomes like a noose, or what do you call that thing you use for
Collar.
Like a collar, like collars. It started saying, it's haram to imitate, to use garlands, because the pre-Islamic, the kuffar did so. And this here, which will complement a message in Surah Al-Maida further, comes out, Allah says, this is not the issue. Just because they did it, it doesn't mean that the Islamic thing is not to do it. What matters is that you cannot divert animals that are being slaughtered on this occasion for a purpose other than what they're being slaughtered for. The hadi are animals that are being slaughtered to feed the poor. What Allah cares about, not whether you put a garland around their neck or you don't put a garland, that as was, in fact, because I actually investigated this, as one of the corruption schemes that kept reoccurring depending on whether you had a good government or not, is that people would try to divert the meat of the slaughtered animals and pretend that these were donated to charitable purposes, but in fact, they were usurped by merchants who sell that meat on the black market. And subhanallah, the reports we have of this is happening like a couple of hundred years after the revelation. But subhanallah, Allah is telling us what Allah cares about is that there be no corruption in this process. Okay. وَلَا آمِينِ الْبَيْتِ الْحَرَامِ يَبْتَغُونَ فَضْلًا مِنْ رَبِّهِمْ وَرِضْوَانًا. Now here, this is one of these parts that is really, to me, وَلَا آمِينِ الْبَيْتِ الْحَرَامِ. And you cannot disrupt, in the same way you cannot disrupt the sha'air. You cannot dilute the sha'air. You cannot deconstruct the sha'air, right? You also, and the sacred month, and the sacrificial, the hadi, the meat for its purposes. Amin al-Bayt al-Haram are those who seek to go to pilgrimage. So those who had, so Muhammad Asad translates it as, nor against those who flock to the sacred, to the haram, to the Kaaba, seeking favor with their Lord. Now, when I looked into the various commentaries and various books on fiqh about Amin al-Bayt al-Haram, so what you have here is that Allah is telling us the Amin, basically people who are heading to the sacred temple, right? And Allah is saying you cannot interfere with this. In the Islamic tradition, until colonialism, this was understood as an obligation to facilitate the path for all Muslims who are seeking to go to Hajj. And in fact, what emerged is a collective ethic that various Muslims must, or they could, if they don't collaborate on anything at all, at a minimum, they must collaborate on facilitating Amin al-Bayt, facilitating the path of those who head to Hajj. Now, that ethic, with the birth of the modern nation state, completely disappeared, because after the birth of the modern nation state, it became a single country that says, I am responsible for Hajj. No one else gets to have any input on Hajj. But what is even, and this, by the way, for those graduate students who want to find something that you could research this and write on it. The juristic debates on the first time of the use of visas in regulating Hajj. We today act like that's no big deal. But it's one thing to say, I am regulating because I don't want there to be such numbers where it poses a danger to people's public health, that people will crush each other because of the crowds. It is quite another to regulate it, to profit from it. That is in contradiction, in my opinion, to this very revelation. You can't profit people from Hajj. You can't regulate it by saying, if you have money, you can come, but if you don't, or, we give this task to, we want to profit or make this a source of income for our GNP. In Saudi Arabia, Hajj is the second largest source of income after oil. It's oil, then Hajj, or Hajj and Umrah. It is only in the modern age, and I'm talking about the last 70 years or so, that this has been accepted as an orthodox position, that you can actually profit. And in fact, most jurists, when they were asked, well, we need to regulate Hajj because of numbers, they said, then you have to do it through Qur'an. You have to do it through a lottery system. It can't be in relation to money. And because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَا أَمِينِ الْبَيْتِ, you can't create obstacles in the path of those who are seeking. Now, when you add to this the political regulation of Hajj, that those who are politically okay with Saudi Arabia get to go, and those who aren't might be arrested in the airport and turned over to the Egyptian government or turned over to the Emirati government. People, I mean, this is why I'm telling you, Al-Maida is so painful. Al-Maida, I can't tell you the amount of sleepless nights, and because you stand there and you say, okay, Allah, guide me. How do we get out of this? We've ended up messing up so much. So how do we get out of this? The commercialization, and this is the when I say wal al hajj, everything that the entire edifice of Mecca and Hajj, and especially in Hajjatul Wada, is that rich and poor had the same opportunities, the same means. There was no distinction between the tent of a rich person and the tent of a poor person. Part of that is that the Kaaba remains the Kaaba in its most basic geometrical form. The square represents a core of unity, represents the covenantal relationship between Allah and human beings, and represents egalitarianism. That around the Kaaba, especially in the Haram, I mean, not just the immediate Haram, but in the entire area of the Haram, the larger Haram, that all buildings are never allowed to rise above the Kaaba explicitly, so that you control disparities in wealth, so that you are maintaining an egalitarian ethic in the vicinity of the Kaaba. People appear before the Kaaba equal in appearance and equal in accommodation, quite explicitly and intentionally so. All of that is gone. I mean, the ease by which Muslims today, and by the way, if you check with your grandparents, you'll find that they still remember the time when it was commonly accepted that it is haram to go to the haram and to enjoy luxuries unavailable to others. I mean, to the extent that I still remember the entire debate. This was in my parents' age, when it was debated whether it's halal for someone to take with them a fan to the haram, because, well, if you're going to have a fan, what if others don't have a fan? And I still remember, like, the extent to which they went to shuyukh and they asked them, is it okay to take a fan? Is it, it was one of these battery operated fans that today you will find Muslims just without a second thought making bookings in, what is it, the Hilton or Sheraton or around there, and just without a second thought, oh yeah, we'll sleep in luxury and wake up in luxury, and we don't need to think about what those who are without means, what their accommodations are. This is a truly a colonization of Islam to the core, because you're not even remembering the original morals or virtues of the faith. Okay. Then, of course, Allah says, and وَإِذَا حَلَلْتُمْ فَاصْطَادُوا, that if you are, once your state of ihram ends, then you can hunt. Again, this is because the issue came up specifically of whether we can hunt in a state of ihram. Now, there are hints of an economic, is that some people ask, well, if we can't hunt, then how are we going to eat meat? And it seems that the response was, it is, or how are we going to eat? Because they didn't say how we can eat meat. They just say how we're going to eat. And the response was, it's that it is the obligation of the people in Mecca to provide for those who were state in ihram. So if someone needs to be fed, it has to be through the institutions of charity that exist in Mecca. But that's a sort of an interesting, larger historical issue that requires more research. Okay, now that is immediately followed by وَلَا يَجْرِمَنَّكُمْ شَنْآنُ قَوْمٍ أَنْ صَدُّوكُمْ عَنِ الْمَسْجِدِ الْحَرَامِ أَنْ تَعْتَدُوا وَتَعَاوَنُوا عَلَى الْبِرِّ وَالتَّقْوَى وَلَا تَعَاوَنُوا عَلى الْإِثْمِ وَالْعُدْوَانِ وَاتَّقُوا اللَّهَ إِنَّ اللَّهَ شَدِيدُ الْعِقَابِ. This is the core of the Islamic covenant. So, do not let your enmity or your hatred of a people, because they barred you from the Masjid al-Haram, lead you into transgression. But rather help one another in furthering virtue, wattaqwa, God consciousness. And do not help one another in furthering evil and enmity. And remain conscious of God, for behold, God is severe in retribution. Okay. Now, there are a number of reports that are puzzled. They're puzzled by the message in this revelation, because it says, don't let the fact that these people prevented you from access to Masjid al-Haram lead you into transgression. And they said, well, that really doesn't happen in the 10th Hijri year. It happened in the 8th Hijri year. It happened when Muslims thought to go to Hajj and the kuffar prevented them. This is before the treaty of Hudaybiyah and before Mecca was defeated. And so some speculated, well, maybe this ayah was revealed earlier, while the beginning of Surah Al-Maida was revealed and the rest of Surah Al-Maida was revealed later. But there's nothing to support that other than the historical speculation that, well, this type of message of don't let the inequity of others prevent you from doing what's right seems to fit the events of the 8th Hijri year. Other than that speculation, there's nothing to support saying that this part of Surah Al-Ma'idah was revealed 2 years earlier. So, but what was going on to invite such a message? Two things. One is the attitude or the report that Ibn Abbas relates to us, that some Muslims thought that it is incumbent that the sha'air, the habits and practices of whatever Mecca followed before Islam must be altered just as a way of, sticking it to Mecca, to say, your old ways don't fit us. And that this type of attitude, which is primarily reactive, I am going to do things differently, not because they're right, but just because they spite you. So that's one. The second, which is even more interesting, is that more interesting and makes a lot of sense. Many of the old-time, or a number of the old-time Muslims from the Ansar, those who fought in battle after battle supporting the Prophet ﷺ, and we're very worried that after the defeat of Mecca, that the Prophet was going to prefer living in Mecca rather than returning to Medina. And they told the Prophet, we supported you, so now that you've conquered your hometown, are you going to stay in your hometown? And he tells them no. His sense of, look at the sense of morality and loyalty. You supported me. I can't bail out on you now that, even though I love Mecca, and even though this is my hometown, but there is a principle to uphold. And he, in fact, returns with them to live in Medina. But they were vocally questioning the loyalty or the faith of the foes of yesterday. They're saying, it wasn't that long ago when you guys did everything to prevent us from having access to Mecca. And now, suddenly, when you were conquered, when you were defeated, you converted to Islam. And now you come, and often, because we are in Medina, we are living in Medina, you are living in Mecca, these Medinian Ansar think of the Kaaba and the Haram as theirs by virtue of Islam. it's not their hometown, but it is what their very relationship to Islam creates that bond, while the native Meccans who converted after Mecca was defeated have the hometown advantage. They're there on the ground, and now that they converted to Islam, they're going back and trying to jostle or trying to compete for all types of positions in servicing the Kaaba and servicing the pilgrims now under the flag of Islam instead of the flag of Jahiliyyah. And the Ansar, some of the prominent Ansar are questioning the motives of these people, saying, really? Now you're really interested in this position where you take care of the Muslim pilgrims, where just a year ago or a couple of years ago your whole service was against Islam. And the Quran comes and says, this is not a game of vindictiveness. This is not a game of who has the hometown advantage, who's the older Muslim, going back to the issue of status. You have an obligation to be just. And it is not an excuse to say, well, they were unfair to us. And this message, because this is something that had being cognizant that I am in the presence of Allah's last message, I was paying very careful attention to how this last message was being received. And subhanAllah, that all the reports that you find is that this silenced the chitter's chatter about, well, should they be allowed to do this or allow? Although, again, one can find their criticism makes perfect sense from a pragmatic perspective. Even their suspicions that these people are not perhaps sincere converts, but from a moral perspective, it doesn't. Because you have an obligation. This is not about the dunya. This is about your relationship to the hereafter. And you have an obligation to be fair and just, even if you have historical injustices inflicted upon you. So you can't negate practices just to stick it to your opponent, just to, get at them. You can't, for convenience or pragmatism, forget the sacred month and sacred time. You can't just say, well, it's not convenient, so we don't have to do it. You can't, for whatever reason, dilute sha'air al-Islam. These are the signposts of what define your faith. You can't play games with them to get tenure at Harvard or, you not allowed. Or tenure anywhere else for that matter. And when you pause and you think, is this all premised on understanding the nature of your covenantal relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And the answer is absolutely yes. All moral virtues flow from being anchored in that ufu bil uqud. You have a contract and a covenant. You have an obligation. You can't take shortcuts and play games with the nature of these obligations. Okay, let's take a 2-minute break. 2 minutes. And we'll be back. Inshallah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Now, we familiarity makes us pass over language, which when we are talking about revelation, divine revelation, that's a very serious problem. Because the exhortation, وَلَا يَجْرُمَنَّكُمْ شَنَآنُ قَوْمٍ أَنْ صَدُّوكُمْ عَنِ الْمَسْجِدِ الْحَرَامِ أَنْ تَعْتَدُوا. So there is a moral precept in this that you are not allowed to commit aggression. And remember, this is, in Surah Al-Maida, this is the last revelation in the Medina period. And we'll talk about this a bit later, but a lot of the claims that unfortunately have become all too accepted by Muslims of abrogation has earlier revelation abrogating later revelation, which is astounding. Even if you accept abrogation, how can the earlier abrogate the later, which is just nonsensical? But Allah, in the last exhortations, like the last commandments, Allah is underscoring that you do not have an excuse to commit aggression, even if that is in response to commit an injustice, even if it is in response to an injustice that you suffered. But then what follows is وَتَعَاوَنُوا عَلَى الْبِرِّ وَالتَّقْوَى. These are وَلَا تَعَاوَنُوا عَلَى الْإِثْمِ وَالْعُدْوَانِ. التعاون is to cooperate, to work together to achieve a goal. When Allah says, and when the Prophet ﷺ is asked, what is al-birr? There are a number of ahadith about this, but some of them, the Prophet ﷺ responds by saying that it is whatever is intuitively whatever it troubles your heart, you know in your heart is wrong, that is contrary to birr. But another set of reports, the Prophet ﷺ summarizes al-birr by saying, al-birr husnul khuluq. It harkens back to that basic question of what are good or sound ethics, husn al-khuluq. What is virtue? Because the Quranic command is that we work together to achieve al-birr. And birr is even a step, it is closest translation in English is virtue, because it is beyond the good. It is not just to achieve what is morally acceptable or even what is morally laudable or praiseworthy, but to go beyond that, to what is the higher moral ground. And sometimes we understand things, or what helps us understand things is the contrast to things, is the opposite. Al-ithm wal-idwan. So, idwan, at a minimum, is any state in which you commit an aggression. Well, you can't understand what is a transgression without first having an understanding of what are the balance of rights and duties that are accrue to a human being. Because an aggression or a transgression is violating the set of rights that are owed to another. If you don't have an understanding of rights, then you will not have an understanding of aggression. But while the sha'air are explicitly revealed to us by Allah, Allah defines to us what the sha'air is. What is sound virtue, what is birr, what is adl, what is contrary to adwan. Allah relies on what is known to us intuitively. It's like, it's precisely, morality is like the soil upon which you plant the seed of Islam. The seed of Islam will not grow in an immoral soil. If the soil itself is corrupt, it will produce nothing. If even it might, the seed might ultimately be overtaken by weeds. But that is core, that your charge as a society is to work with one another in achieving birr and taqwa. Taqwa, of course, is God consciousness. Think of everything that would be required educationally, that would be required in terms of our social dynamics, that would be required in terms of our social habits in order to promote God consciousness. Parts of God consciousness cannot be as-sudud anillah, that if what you teach results from people being turned off the divine, people being led away from the divine because the teachings are incomprehensible, or the teachings are harsh, or the teachings are not beautiful, that is not going to achieve taqwa as God consciousness. Taqwa, the relationship between the teachings of justice and teachings of God's consciousness, it's like an umbilical relationship. It is inseparable from one another. If you allow for people to grow with oblivious to justice, or ignorant of justice, or accepting that God and injustice can exist with one another, invariably that will undermine God consciousness. I mean, when I wrote The Search for Beauty in Islam, the whole concept of beauty is anchored in the notion of birr as a necessary corollary to taqwa, to God consciousness. Because human experience shows that the dynamics of God consciousness becomes skewed and corrupted when it is anchored on a platform of injustice and ugliness and cruelty and harshness. In order to get human beings to be in a state to develop the potential of God consciousness, you can only do so by human beings seeing that the same advocates for taqwa are also advocates for birr. Meaning that if I see that the same people who are advocating God consciousness are also the advocates for justice and goodness and beauty, that will help my God consciousness. But if the advocates for God consciousness are not advocates for justice or goodness or beauty, which is the state we have today among Muslims, what happens is that people's understanding of God consciousness becomes skewed and corrupted. That is why in the Quran you always find birr tied to taqwa. Al-birr wa taqwa. Allah alerting us that they go together. You can't rip them apart and pretend that it's workable. Okay. I mean, if we had real modern institutions of Islamic learning, real Islamic learning, not the nonsense that goes on, you could have an entire discourse develop on just that. Al-birr husnul khuluq. To understand husnul khuluq and to understand husnul khuluq in the modern moment and to understand what is it and what parts of akhlaq are immutable and eternal and primordial, and what parts of akhlaq are circumstantial, and precisely working out the relationship between akhlaq and all of these are, it's exactly when our ancestors exploded upon the scene with an intellectual civilization. That's the whole difference between them and us, is that they were investing their resources in these types of questions that they took very seriously. Muslims of today don't take words seriously. And as a result, they don't invest in investigations of knowledge because they really don't understand what is there to know. I mean, the reason you can't convince wealthy people to invest in something like this is because they have no clue. Why would something like birr and taqwa need an investigation or need an investment? Or why do you need highly learned people to discourse about birr and taqwa? Why can't you just have, the rhetorical speeches that we have, where you cite a few hadiths and cite a few ayat and then you go on? And, educated money is smart money. Okay. Then, and I will come back and sort of give an overall explanation later on, but for now, then Allah moves on to underscoring the basics of Sha'air al-Islam, the still we are on the topic of what are the core precepts of this Islamic faith that the the core, if you will, foundation upon which you cannot claim that you have an Islamic religion at all. So, Surah Al-Maida moves on to underscore حرمت عليكم الميتة والدم ولحم الخنزير وما أهل لغير الله به والمنخنقة والموقوذة والمتردية والنطيحة وما أكل السبع إلا ما زكيتم وما ذبح على النصب وأن تستقسموا بالأزلام ذلكم فسق اليوم يئس الذين كفروا من دينكم فلا تخشوهم واخشوني اليوم أكملت لكم دينكم وأتممت عليكم نعمتي ورضيت لكم الإسلام دينا فمن اضطر في مخمصة غير متجانف لإثم فإن الله غفور رحيم يسألونك ماذا أحل لهم قل أحل لكم الطيبات وما علمتم من الجوارح مكلبين تعلمونهم مما علمكم الله فكلوا مما أمسكن عليكم واذكروا اسم الله عليه واتقوا الله إن الله سريع الحساب. Okay, so again, and this we'll see how this ties to talking about the recipients of earlier religions or the earlier message. But Allah underscores that what is prohibited for you Muslims. Let's use the translation as faster. Okay. Okay. It's okay. So forbidden for you is carrion, basically the meat of dead animals or animals that you find dead, and blood itself, blood found cooked with the meat of animals is halal, but the consumption of blood alone is haram. So carrion, of course, is dead animals, blood, and the flesh of swine, pigs, and anything, in principle, anything upon which that was killed without invoking Allah's name. I'll come back to this in a second. And anything that has been beaten to death or strangled or killed in a fall or gored to death by another animal or savaged by another beast, so animals which were killed by other animals. The exception to this are animals killed by animals that you've trained as hunting animals. The exception to this are like hunting dogs or falcons, hunting falcons. In the old days, sometimes people would train other beasts to be used as hunting animals. However, with hunting animals, there is a juristic debate as to whether you must catch the prey before it dies and slaughter it ritualistically. So in other words, the falcon, or whether in fact it's okay even if the animal had died because it was attacked by a hunting animal, as long as you once you gain possession of the hunted animal, you mention Allah's name on it. I don't want to get into the details of the juristic debate because it's not. I don't know how many of you use hunting animals these days, and of course, so the principle is that the meat, the flow of blood outside of the animal that is consumed, that's one. But more importantly, that anything killed must be killed Allah's name having been mentioned on it. That is, as I mentioned before, and as the Quran says before, that you cannot take a life. The only reason, the only claim that you have in taking the life of something for your own survival is that you are doing it with God's permission. But for God's permission, you would have no right to kill anything for your own survival. Okay. So notice here that when God refers to animals trained as hunting animals, the expression is fascinating. I'm blanking out. Yeah. I skipped. Oh, that's why I skipped ahead a little bit for verse 4. But anyway, it's okay. So, وما علمتم من الجوارح مكلبين تعلمونهم مما علمكم الله. What you've trained, teaching them from what Allah has taught you. This is a consistent Quranic attitude towards knowledge. You have knowledge that you impart, and you could impart even to an animal in training an animal. But all knowledge flows from the source of all knowing, and that is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is why your ancestors maintained, or their attitude towards the suppression of the pursuit of knowledge, was that it's such a huge sin. Because what you learn, in fact, you are not learning it. It is Allah teaching it to you. And when you teach what you've learned, you are teaching what Allah taught you. In the same way that in the structure of rites and our covenantal relationship, the money that we say we own, actually we don't own, but we are entrusted with. And the bodies that we say we own, we actually don't own, but we are entrusted with. The knowledge that we acquire, we actually don't acquire. It's not our knowledge. It is God's knowledge that entrusted us with. And that is precisely why you have your relationship to this knowledge cannot be separated from your moral obligations. This is a bigger issue about in the philosophy of science in the West, there is often this whole thing about separating morality from scientific pursuits. In the Islamic outlook, you cannot separate ethics from the enterprise of knowledge, because you cannot separate God from the enterprise of knowledge. Every discovery that is made because of God and due to God. So you don't say, I discovered. You'd say, Allah led me to discover. Or you don't really say, I learned. You'd say, Allah led me to learn. And that is why, when all said and done, when you sit with your bundle of knowledge, core, and I wish our graduate students would learn this, Muslim graduate students, is that core to your relationship of that knowledge, the dissertation that you've wrote, the books that you're planning, the articles that you're thinking about, is core to it is your relationship with Allah, and Allah having entrusted you with this knowledge. And that is precisely why, if you end up using this knowledge for reasons that undermine al-birr wa taqwa, you're held responsible. And that is also why you are under an obligation to use your knowledge to promote al-birr wa taqwa, not to undermine al-birr wa taqwa. And the entire thrust of Surah Al-Maida, as we will see, is that including using this knowledge to uphold sha'air al-Islam, to uphold the ethics of Islam, because it is ultimately God's knowledge. And notice that Allah doesn't even allow this occasion to pass and say, just use hunting animals. But it says, because you teach these animals from what Allah has taught you. So even as we relate to these animals, and I wish I could remember where I read. It might be. I have a vague memory that it's the book, The Superiority of Dogs, or maybe it was Al-Aqd Farid. I wish I marked it or wrote it down at the time, where it was a few sentences about why cruelty or in training animals is not allowed. And the passage, I can remember the words more or less, but I can't remember where I read it. It basically says that because the whole dynamic of training the animal, and the author cites this and says, it's not from you. It's you are using the knowledge that God gave you to train an animal. So you can't torture an animal because that is not part of the divine knowledge. Just in these passages that were written in the Islamic tradition so casually, but that reflected a world of ethical consciousness. Okay. Oh, okay, because I skipped ahead a bit. So, and also, مَا ذُبِحَ عَنْ نُصُبٍ, also forbidden, is not just animals beaten to death, or animals that fell to death, or animals that were killed by what do you call it? Huh? Animals of prey. Yeah, animals. But around Mecca, the Kaaba used to be surrounded by these altars that were used to sacrifice animals. And of course, the pre-Islamic Arabs would have, like a lot of old practices, they would use the sacrificial blood as a form of performing rituals to various gods and goddesses and so on. But ما ذبح عن نصب, yeah, Muhammad Asad just translates it as idolatrous altars. That whatever is killed on an altar other than for Allah, and Muslims don't kill an animal on an altar anyway, that is, you can't consume that meat. And included in the abolished practices, al-istiqsam bil-azlam, which in, again, pre-Islamic practices, a form of divination, was basically what they did is that there are arrows, and these arrows are all marked with different coded colors, and certain colors mean go ahead. Certain colors mean you have to sacrifice X number of animals. Other colors mean absolutely not. And people would go and they would pay money for the priest to then tell them what they should do by pulling out certain arrows and basically divining the future. Divination of the future, whether through the use of arrows or through the use of stars or the use of, even sand and stone were used to divine the future, or even one of the oldest practices was to spill blood and watch the flow of blood, and then the priest would divine the future by the way the blood flows on the ground. All forms of divination was, and for our modern mind, is sort of so what? But you have to understand that for the medieval mind, to prohibit divination was nothing short of a revolution. Because in the medieval mind, it was firmly believed that the future is encoded in various things in nature. Whether the way birds fly, whether the way fish swim, the way the wind blows, the way that you read the stars, that nature is constantly encoded with the future of people who matter. Not all people, but people who matter. Because nature itself differentiated between the status of people. Certain people were not worthy of nature divining anything for. While, of course, kings and princesses and royalty and so on, these are... And part of the reason that there was so much resistance even after Islam, because forms of divination continued to exist even after the Islamic revelation throughout history, is because they were so culturally embedded. But to transform your relationship to nature to this covenantal relationship with the divine, which Allah, as we will see, Surah Al-Maida reminds us, like Surah Al-Baqarah did, that Allah has repeatedly told human beings, this is what monotheism is about. Monotheism includes ridding oneself of all form of superstition and mythology and surrendering to the premise that all fate and all willpower belongs in the one and only God is such a radical departure. And it failed. It consistently failed among human beings. And this is why Allah kept sending prophets to bring back the premises of monotheism. And Muhammad والسلام, was the final bearer of that message. I mean, allow this to sink in. All good and evil, all thinking about fate, the very notion of willpower is all contingent on that covenantal relationship with the divine. That in itself is a revolution. We'll come back to it, because Surah Al-Maida comes back to it. Okay. So, Al-Istiqsam bil-Azlam is described, ذَلِكُمْ فِسْقٌ, that means the emphasis, that this is truly sinful to surrender to any form of divination, or to surrender to divination. And here, when in Surah Al-Maida, the proclamation that put at least the closest people to the Prophet ﷺ, on the one hand, it was, they understood what the Quran was saying, but on the other hand, it created a substantial amount of concern and anxiety that we are approaching the end of the companionship of the Prophet ﷺ. Because Allah comes at this occasion and tells him, اليوم أكملت لكم دينكم, that now your religion has been completed. I've perfected, Muhammad Asad translated, I perfected your religious law for you. What he means by this is that he imagines that Surah Al-Ma'idah, Allah was, because we're approaching the end, Allah is making sure all the religious laws are finalized. But it is not the religious laws that are being finalized. It is the religious laws and the ethical laws that Allah is saying, be conscious that now I've said everything you need to know. Allah is not referring to what the revelation just said about meat, or about sha'air, or even about al-birr wa taqwa, or even about justice. Allah is referring to everything that preceded this revelation. وَأَتْمَمْتُ عَلَيْكُمْ نِعْمَتِي, and you have now received the full blessing. It's like saying, now I am relinquishing the trust to your hands. وَرَضِيتُ لَكُمُ الْإِسْلَامَ دِينًا, and this, I mean, رَضِيتُ لَكُمْ would, on first appearance, would seem to read that, and I've content that Islam has become your religion. But Islam, remember, is the religion of all the monotheistic prophets. It is the religion of Ibrahim alayhi salam and Isa alayhi salam and Musa alayhi salam and all the prophets. The message here is, again, now I've entrusted you with the truth of what Islam is. It's like Allah has accompanied you in this revelation for the past 20 years. You have been the recipients of repeated instructions. There is no other prophet, there is no other revelation. The entire trust of Islam is left now in your hands. But this is particularly, as we will see in Surah Al-Maida, this is particularly why it becomes critical that Allah reminds Muslims again of the message started with Surah Al-Baqarah, that your relationship to Islam is not a matter of status. It's a matter of service. How you are going to serve. It's like, remember again, the whole notion of the covenant. That if Allah says, I've gifted you, or I now put my trust in you with the message of Islam, what bundle of obligations and duties, what bundle of covenantal obligations and duties attach to the rida, that entrustment that Allah has of Islam to us. Especially when we bear in mind that this is the Islam of all the prophets. So what we are in fact inheriting is the message of the entire line of prophets in the monotheistic faith. The sha'air might be different, as we will see, but the core of the message itself is the same. Okay. So now that you are entrusted with this faith, and as Surah Al-Maida will clarify as we go on, that while the sha'air that Allah decreed to different people in the core message might have been different, and in fact will remain different, because as Surah Al-Ma'idah clarifies, that the sha'air of the Jews are different from the sha'air of the Christians, are different from the sha'air of Muslims. But that core message itself is one in which you are entrusted with, and is core to the covenantal relationship, as we will see. Okay. What time is it? Oh. It's 9:20 and we are at verse 4. Okay, the good news is that that means halaqat might continue for a while. Because at this pace, we need maybe another year to get through Surah Al-Ma'idah. No, I'm kidding. It's not going to be a year. Okay, let's stop here, and because there's a lot, and I don't trust myself to say anything else without going another hour, so I'm gonna stop here. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Next halaqa, inshallah, will be strange because Grace will not be here to introduce it. Um, who's going to introduce it? Marwa's introducing it. Is it Cheyenne? Oh. Okay, they can't agree on who's going to introduce. They're arguing. So someone will introduce it, or I'll just start without an introduction, which is, sort of. But anyway, they're still arguing. Okay. Even Sharif is not going to be here. And Joe is not going to be here. I'm being abandoned by everyone. They're all.
Can you skip one Saturday?
We can see the first trader on camera right now.
Oh yes, yes.
Trader number 1.
Oh.
Well, the first trader was Ramin.
No, he's been a trader for a long time. I mean,
Okay, yeah. And then the second trader, and then the third trader.
Woodsky. I know. Happy birthday, Woodsky. Yay! um, I don't know if she can hear you. What did you say? Well, I'm not passing that on.
Rami said something mean to you.
Of course, she's sending love, as usual. So, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Oh my gosh, what a start to Surah Maida, and we're at verse 4. Woohoo! But it's so you just feel the weight of it. I mean, obviously, the idea, even just the idea that this is the very last revelation in Medina, and that the Prophet, peace be upon him, died 80 or 81 days after its conclusion, is just mind-blowing. And, just a few highlights. I didn't get through everything because I just felt like there was just so much. But, sharing with us that, no one has said that the Surah Maida is sort of the natural conclusion to Surah Baqarah, and excited to see how that develops. And just reminding us again that there, how Surah Baqarah came to really make it clear that there is no such thing as a chosen people. There's no set fate, no caste system, no predestination, which is so liberating at so many levels. And then just to underscore the whole idea of the covenantal relationship between Allah and human beings, how Allah teaches us principles and values, and that our relationship with Allah is in direct proportion to how we embody those principles and values. And just to start with a very powerful command to honor our obligations, keep our word, honor our word, and the idea, of sha'air, or rituals, in quotes right now, as you continue to develop that. But the idea that even if you don't understand them, that these are things that we are obligated to honor, and they're built on things that are not accessible to human reason. And I think the whole discussion again about the book "What is Islam" is really important for us now, because that has had such an impact on people. And so it's sort of stunning when you know that backdrop, and then now you delve into Surah, Al-Maida, and you study these verses about honoring sha'air. And then just the discussion on sacred months and sacred meat, and even the support of people, like not getting in the way of people who are going to pilgrimage, and then like thinking about what's happening right now in Mecca and in the Haram, and what everything from things being built taller than the Kaaba to just the really like the loss of the ethic of egalitarianism, of no distinction between the wealthy and the poor, and all of those things that really stunning that has happened, and you're just wondering like, okay, what's going to happen? You know, obviously Allah has made it very clear what we're supposed to do, and when you see how blatantly those things have been discarded, it's frightening. And I think just the feeling again, like the whole tenor of this surah being so weighty, like this is the last, you know, this is what I leave you with, and it's not just about Islam for just what came to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, but for all of the prophets. And now I entrust you with this. It is terrifying, honestly. And so anyway, I'm so excited to continue. So I'm not going to be here in person, but I will join the virtual team, the interactive group. Because I'm going to go visit my parents, and so that's, and you know, honoring that obligation. So inshallah, otherwise I would not leave, because this is just too wonderful. And so anyway, these guys are going to just have to like. I'm going to decide who's going to do the introduction. No, but actually, I'm excited. I want personally. Marwa to come share some of the really exciting things that have been happening with the Prophet's pulpit, because I actually, the messages that we continue to receive from all points in the world are truly like humbling and exciting. And you know, we're still working on our little map with putting, you know, the dots on, but we just haven't had time because there's just been so many demands for books all around the world. But when you hear the stories and you read the emails that we get from people who are so touched, so excited, so honored, you know, just to be able to get a copy of this book that either they can't afford, or they can't find where they are, or, you know, just for whatever reason, they're just so grateful. And, you know, from our perspective, it's exciting because this is sharing that really beautiful, liberating Quranic message, you know, everything we've been learning here in the tafsir. And I oftentimes, we talk about like the Prophet's pulpit as being kind of the tafsir light, you know, because it's hard to jump in and do like 6-hour halakas and, you know, really like do these intensive deep dives. But the Prophet's pulpit is so powerful because you're taking that core, the essence of the message we're learning here, and then just applying it to our world, and trying to normalize the theme of us as Muslims being active and justice-oriented, and, you know, at the forefront of the world, and thinking and engaging things, and having common sense, right? And speaking about our religion in a way that is compelling and heartwarming and exciting and intuitive. Like, that's just something that we just don't seem to get in many Muslim spaces, sadly. So it's really exciting when we can share that book, which is really a beautiful, like physically beautiful book, and then spiritually, you know, internally very beautiful book, with people all around the world, and creating that connection so people don't feel so lonely, and they don't feel gaslit when they hear something in their religion that they don't feel in their heart or in their mind. So I would love for you know, Marwa to just share some of that, so everyone understands like how many people, where are they coming from, what are some of the messages, because it's heartwarming, and it actually adds something to all of our community. Even if we're not physically together, we're connected, you know. And so alhamdulillah for at least technology in our world for that goodness. So anyway, I will join you virtually next week. But in the meantime, inshallah, I hope everyone has a wonderful week. Thank you for joining us on this really monumentous surah, this whole journey. And yeah, enjoy your last couple weeks of December 2022. But anyway, assalamu alaikum. Have a great week. Okay. Bye.